About 23 years ago, I left a very successful corporate career in manufacturing management and decided to study psychology. Some people thought I was crazy. In the graduate program that I went to, they encouraged us very strongly to excavate every nook and cranny of our psyche. And as I did that, I arrived at a poignant and rather painful awareness that as a third-generation German American, I carried significant cultural shame related to the Holocaust. Let me explain. I was born in Freiburg, Germany, to a German mother and an American father. We lived in Europe for 16 years, and I spent 10 years of those in Germany. I went to Army schools, spoke English, of course, and identified primarily as American, but I spoke German fluently, played with German kids after school all the time, and spent a lot of time with my German relatives. In fact, I was extremely close to my German grandmother, Omi. So, back to college. When I studied engineering, I also studied German literature. And even though I was back in the States, it ignited my love for Germany again. And so I made a promise to myself that if I ever had kids, I wanted to make sure to expose them to my German heritage. My daughter Marie was born 12 years later, and when she was just a babe, 6 months old, we started one of many trips to Germany. So back to the grad school experience, as I learned or tried to learn more about my family's World War II experience, my questions were met with silence. It was clear that I was in taboo territory. But slowly, the more I probed and asked, I started hearing harrowing stories from my mother, my aunt, and other relatives of what it was like to grow up in war-torn Germany. They were children at the time. Then, to my surprise, I learned that my grandfather, who didn't survive the war, had in fact fought in Hitler's army. That had been held as a secret the entire time I grew up. So it was really quite shocking to me. And I have to say, it really challenged my image of my family and my grandfather. At about that time, I was nearing the end of my coursework, and my dissertation advisor thought it would be really cool if I researched cultural shame. Well, I wasn't thrilled with the idea, but I thought perhaps I should. But secretly in the background, I was actually coming up with a second topic. The very day I was supposed to commit to my topic, my daughter Marie, who was a second grader at the time, walked through the door, burst into tears. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "Mom, they told me on the playground that Omi is a Nazi." And I knew that at that point she did not know what Nazi meant. But what was evident was that she knew it was a bad thing. And that she, being German identified and having a grandmother who was German, was bad also, simply by association. I was heartbroken. And it became very, very clear to me in that moment. I had no other choice than to research cultural shame. I have to tell you that the experience was excruciating. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. My family wondered what I was trying to prove. My friends chastised me for paying any attention to the evil perpetrator population. I heard comments like, "I'm never stepping foot in that country. Those Germans are still dangerous." And of course, I took all that personally. At the very same time, however, that period, it took about 2 years of working on that dissertation and researching with my participants, was the most transformative process I have ever been through. One thing it did is it helped me come to terms with cultural culpability and personal accountability. I got to the place of being able to embrace what's beautiful about that culture and own what was horrific about the past. I also really got to a place of having an incredible sense of humility and felt more open, more fallible, and quite frankly, somewhat freed from the stranglehold of cultural shame. When I finished with my dissertation, you might imagine, I was looking forward to putting shame behind me. And we moved up to Snohomish County, and I started my consulting and coaching practice. And now, 12 years later, what I have to say to you is I think that unacknowledged and unprocessed shame wreaks havoc everywhere. I see the effects of it in families. I see it in workplaces where it infects the work culture. I see it create hostility in communities. It's present everywhere. So what I'd like to do today is spend the rest of the time talking about the transformative power of shame. First of all, shame is an inevitable part of the human experience. We're not supposed to prevent it or avoid it or overcome it so that we don't have it in our lives anymore. We wish that were true, but it's not. The second thing is because shame is such a toxic experience, we have an automatic defense mechanism to resist it. And often we don't even know that it's happening for us. The third thing is that shame truly has a transformative potential. It feels toxic, but what it does for us is it helps us develop capacities like humility, compassion, integrity, and dignity. In order for that to happen, we just need to decide to work with it. Sylvan Tompkins was a psychologist in the 1960s. His work has been largely ignored. And he discovered that shame is an inevitable part of our emotional DNA. It's part of being human, and there's no way to cause ourselves not to have the experience. What he also discovered was that it happens involuntarily. So you might get a criticism from somebody and then have what I call a shame attack. There's no way to make that not happen. It's going to happen. Tompkins called shame affect, and I mean with an A, not an E, the biological part of the shame experience. So it's what happens in our bodies in fractions of a second before we even know what has hit us. The other thing that Tompkins discovered was that children, this is the amazing thing, that infants actually experience shame. They don't have words yet, and they know shame. He studied children all across the globe and saw this happen in children that were just weeks old. So you might think of this as babies come into the world knowing how to do shame. When shame is at its worst, when we have closer to a humiliation experience, it really does make us feel fundamentally defective. We're worthless. We don't deserve to exist on the planet. And most of the time, people just want to kind of sink into the ground and disappear from view. So now to the second point, the whole idea that we resist shame. Because it is such a punishing experience, and we are very creative human beings, we've developed an unconscious defense mechanism that essentially says no to shame. So it may happen and unfold in our bodies just in seconds, and we don't even notice that it happens, and automatically the defense mechanism kicks in. It works like a charm. Donald Nathanson was a psychiatrist in more recent history, and he came up with a model that he called the compass of shame that shows us the 4 different maneuvers that we might use so that we don't have to have the experience. I think of this as shame resistance. So when we withdraw, what we do is we detach. We detach emotionally, we detach physically. I have a very well-developed withdrawal response. If I feel criticized by my husband, he says, I retreat into silence. He's absolutely correct. The avoid response is one where we want to disengage and not have to experience the sting of shame. And most of us do that by numbing. So, fantasy football, TV, chocolate, alcohol, retail therapy. There are many, many ways for us to numb ourselves and avoid the shame experience. A third mode he called attack self. And that's basically when we condemn ourselves, we become our own worst enemy, and we do a lot of self-criticism. I think of that as bullying turned inward. And then finally, we go to the attack other mode. And that one is fortified by anger. And it's one in which we feel really self-justified in kind of externalizing the shame and pinning it onto someone else. So when we see someone be overtly defensive, when we see them justify their behavior, or when we see them kind of doing the blame and shame game, blaming other people, they're caught in the attack other mode. So I've had a lot of experience with this compass. And so I want to tell you a story that will tell you just how quickly it unfolds. It was about 8 years ago, shortly after moving here, and my consulting business was young. And I developed a proposal for a manufacturing organization that I was really proud of. It was very, very in-depth. And it would have launched my work to the next level. So I emailed it in and didn't hear back for 7 long months. Well, that gave the self-attack part of me an awful lot of time to dream up all of the reasons they had rejected me. Then, one day, I'm sitting at my computer in the comfort of my home office. I think I was in my jammies. And an email comes through, and it's from Steve. And he writes, "Sorry for the delay. We're so ready to move forward. We can't wait to get started." Well, I want to do a happy dance. I almost fell off my chair. And I was so excited, I really didn't know what to do with myself. So I thought, I'm going to email my husband. He was out of town. And so I craft this very giddy, you won't believe what happened, kind of unprofessional email. And I even say, they finally got their act together. And then I hit send. Well, what I still didn't realize was I had hit reply, not forward. So you can imagine. I convinced myself in about 3 nanoseconds that I was a failure, my consulting practice was over, and I might as well just tell them I'm not available. So you might think from my story that shame resistance is the problem. Well, what I'd like to tell you is that when we are aware of it, it is actually part of the solution. Because when we know we're kind of stuck in that kind of mode of thinking and operating, it tells us we've had a shame attack. And then we can do something about it. What I have learned is even when the last thing in the world I want to do is to turn toward the shame experience and work it through, that is actually the answer. And what we need to do, and what I did in that case, is as much as I dreaded it, I called John, I relayed the story, I experienced shame all over again. My husband, he was very patient, empathized quite a bit. Then he said, he may not have even read the email. And then finally he reminded me that running away from this opportunity was not the only option. Oh, I've clicked too far ahead. This would be a shame moment. But I'm still standing. So what I have learned is that when we're aware of a shame attack, when we can notice it, when we can realize we're in the compass of shame, when we're resisting, we have a choice. And that choice can be the most productive thing that we do. What happens is we learn how to move through shame attacks more quickly and productively. They don't keep us down as long. The second thing is we learn to reach out for support faster so that we don't isolate as long as shame causes us to do. And third, and this is really important, we develop compassion for ourselves. And it's so much easier to forgive ourselves for quote unquote being human. I think one of the most important things I've learned about working through shame is that it is putting a nail in the fantasy that perfection is the minimum standard. By the way, if you happen to be wondering what happened with Steve, I called him back. He answered the phone. I don't think he had read the email. He was so happy to hear from me. And long story short, he hired me, and 8 years later, we are still doing incredible work together. So I liken this process, and I'm going to try to find that slide because it's such a good one. I liken this process to doing what the alchemists did in the Middle Ages. They tried to turn base metals, impure metals, and transform them into gold. And so they, in essence, were turning dung into gold. And when we work with shame and really commit to doing it as a lifelong process, we are opening ourselves up to this mysterious process that has the potential to transform us. The writer Flannery O'Connor wrote that the first product of self-knowledge is humility. What's so interesting is humility, and humiliation share the same Latin root. So a way to think about the shame experience in a transformative way is to realize that it offers us a priceless gift. It helps us develop capacities for compassion, integrity, humility, and dignity. It helps us engage more fully in life instead of running from situations that are difficult. And I believe it helps us bring our best selves forward. So what I want to leave you with is, I think when we face and embrace shame, we create our future, one shame moment at a time. Thank you.